Hello YouTube. This video, you probably can't tell from pile of parts, but this is the Taurus PT145 Millenium Pro. And we're starting this one a little different than we normally do because there's some important things about this gun, about what you should and shouldn't do, and we want to go over those first. So we're actually starting with the entire lower assembly disassembled to demonstrate exactly what the problems are. So first off, if you don't know, this gun was recalled and there was a big lawsuit, and Taurus basically says, send us your old gun and we'll either give you a couple $100 or trade it in potentially for a G2 series. And the problem with the gun is that it has no drop safety. It relies completely on the firing pin safety for any G-force related incidents, and that doesn't work because the firing pin safety is essentially somewhat weak and has a small spring and a very small engagement area with the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, there's no good way to make it safe, and we're going to show you a little bit of why, or at least my thoughts on why, based on what I've seen on the insides. But the almost more important aspect of this is that when you get into the frame, so this is the polymer part, and this piece basically tucks in the back and then is held in with these two pins. So once this is out of the polymer, this is the metal bit, and Taurus has made this in such a way that you cannot take apart the back. I have taken mine apart, but basically no matter how you slice it, you're going to find that you're going to have to damage this piece and at least one of the two metal inserts involved in it. There's the actual ejector here, or this other side piece, which is just to hold in some of the guts. But basically, the problem, I'll show you up front, if you can get a good enough look at these pins, hopefully the camera is going to focus for me, you'll see that the head of the pin is serrated, like little gears on the far end from my finger here. And what that means is that when you put this pin into a hole, you put in the smooth side first, and then the serrations we will basically bottom out. And to drive the pin the rest of the way in, you hammer it really hard, and it will deform the aluminum as it goes into it. Now, the other pieces that are then there, like if the extractor, or ejector rather, was actually in, this pin actually goes through the holes in the ejector here. And these holes are not big enough for the serrated end to get through. So your choices are, if you really had to pound one of these out, that you would be either stripping a combination of two things at once. A, you'd be stripping the gear striations on the pin, or you'd be adding striations to this metal piece and changing its shape. And in either case, things are not going to go back together well. And the other part is that this pin, which we'll get into in a minute, holds in the part of the safety that interacts with the sear, and it's pressed in as well in such a way that it's nearly impossible to knock it out. It takes a couple tricks that were very unpleasant to perform. So I'm going to go ahead and show you reassembly of this to the point where once I get it to a particular point, I'm going to tell you when you're disassembling, stop here. So that's what we're going to kind of start with here, is building it back up to that point. And that consists of getting this pin started again. I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to get some of this in here without oiling it up in some fashion. And so I'm going to get that started if I can. Try and get it relatively straight and then start it in just a little bit. And it's going relatively straight now. I'm going to stop there and see if I've gotten inside yet. No. So this is tricky because of the way the sear and the safety interact. The sear sits upright like this, and the safety actually sits like this, attached to the sear system, and the pin that we're monkeying with right now goes through the other hole in the safety. And the problem is that you can't put these two pieces in at the same time. They're too wide. And so in order to get this all to happen, you kind of have to drop them into place one at a time, and then pound the pin through them. And I won't lie, I'm not even 100% sure how to start that process. I guess if I drive this a little bit further in, I'll have a start point and be able to hook up a new light switch if I'm not careful. Alright, so that should be in enough to be protruding just a little bit, which is going to let me get my safety in there. If I can't even do that, I'm going to have to manipulate this with something tiny to get it to lay in place where I need it. Oh, am I off frame? Sorry. And that is exactly backwards. There we go. So that's where that piece goes, but it also, that stubby little pin that I'm putting it onto, has an extra wide head, which means that this piece doesn't just go onto it, but it has to be pressed onto it. That's the equivalent of what I'm doing here as I hammer it down into place. It's not going to freely move until I get it all the way in there, and I don't necessarily want to get it all the way in there till I get the sear on it, which is going to potentially make it nearly impossible to see anything else that I'm doing while I have to hammer. So again, the reason you're not going to get to see a whole lot of this up close on camera is because there's just no point. By design, you're not going to be able to do squat about this particular gun. This part of it. I mean, there's plenty of the rest of the gun that's going to be modifiable. If you, for some reason, don't want to take advantage of the buyback / turn-in process. And again, it's all about convincing this thing to go all the way into where we want it. And it really doesn't want to go there. Probably need to use gentle application of force. Or completely fail and let it fall back over. I can tell you I have spent many hours trying to find an easy way to get this thing in. And that's damn close. There we go. So now my sear is back onto the safety, and the challenge is now getting that safety to drive in all the rest of the way as we also seat the pin in from underneath the rest of the way. So another whack on the top, and then switch it over and drive this in a little further. As a matter of fact, we can probably get this one all the way in, and that is close. Now we're just going to have to get the safety to pop down over it, which hopefully we can accomplish with some carefully targeted taps on either side of it. Okay, so with that done, we now have the sear moving freely and the safety also moving freely, which is what we needed. So that's part one of the why is this thing as crazy messed up as it is challenge. Part two is that there's a series of 4 pins, 2 long, and actually I think 3 long and 1 short is what it ends up totaling. And of course, whether my memory will be good enough to remember which one went where. I want to say that this one was where the other short side went, and that the 2 long ones were on here where they held the extractor in. And then this pin is the sear pin, and basically the loop of the spring is going to go through a cross pin that they left as this crazy long cross member thing. So it goes in and has just a bent stick kind of design, and probably because it's a giant pain in the butt to get it into place, it needs to be like this. So it's like that, except that this piece here, this flippy bit, actually goes all the way towards the bottom. And what that means, I'm sorry, I brought that whole thing off phrase. This little piece is actually supposed to be all the way at the bottom, which essentially means there's no easy way. At least I didn't spot the assembly trick that they must use at the assembly line to make it so this can be done, quickly. Maybe everyone in Brazil just has much tinier hands than me. Because essentially, that could be it too, that they get that part through first and then roll the sear back over it. That might actually work. So I'm going to try to logically get, oops, not that. That wasn't logical at all. My theory here is if I can get the spring through the punch, now my punch is going to hold the spring, and as I come in with the real pin to replace that just started, but I don't want to lose the punch end. I'm going to bring the sear up and make sure, and this is the challenge bit I think here, actually I'm going to do that before I put the pin in at all, is can we actually get this sear flipped over in such a way that the spring is actually under it. guessed this sear is just all kinds of challenging to attempt to manipulate. Yeah, that idea is no good either. I'm just going to try and figure out how this got in here to begin with. That's possible that maybe I can grab it all the way by the back leg. Oops. That's not going to help me if that goes in there first. But it's conceivable. But that's going to get it. So now we have our sear under sear pressure. And so that part, you know, not rocket science, so to speak, and anybody should be able to pull that one off. But here's where things get feisty. I'm going to slide the ejector back into its place, and hopefully get it right the first time. By just a little bit in this direction. Looks better. Alright, so as I mentioned, the longer pins go in this side. So, and now when I put this in, I can't drive it all the way through because that extra big head is going to get in the way of everything. But the whole point here is that you don't want to do that anyway. You don't really want to take it this far apart. So if you did manage to get it this far apart, then bully for you, but now your gun's going to be even more broken when it started, just because of the nature of this almost cruel design. So now get the other long pin. Hopefully whoops, no, that's the roll pin. That's the other thing. The odd pin out is a roll pin, which gave me hope at first that there was some pattern of order, that if I figured it out, you know, you can get the roll pin out, and, you know, hip bones connected to the leg bone, and there would maybe be a pattern that would let you get all four of those out without destroying one of them. I just wasn't there, so I ended up picking the one I thought I could most easily live without, and driving it all the way through one of the other pieces of sheet metal. That's the other thing, is there's no way to get good purchase on tapping these in and out. So, once you get it started, that's a good thing. And then switch to the more correct size. Okay, so now those are in and they're recessed enough that they're not going to mess with the action of the slide through the rails. So we'll go to the other side and I will kind of illustrate what the original conundrum was. And this is kind of it. If I wanted to drive this rear pin out, whether it was on the rear pin on this side or the rear pin on this side, I'm going to run into the sear. And getting, even if you were able to get that pin out and everything else pressed out, you'd still have to drive them towards the inside. There's no way to get in the middle and push these pins out. So you have two serrated head pins, essentially directly opposed from each other, and there's no way around that puzzle. That's just you're doomed point in the assembly. And so let me see if I can find the right size roll pin punch. Get this thing in place. Oh, Mr. Butterfingers tonight doesn't want to start. Alright, there we go. Started a little bit. And through. Alright, so that's going to hold it in place, but just to add insult to injury. And yeah, I can see that this head one took the most damage. This is the one that I pushed all the way through. So it actually wallowed out a nice, much larger hole in the back of this piece than it really needed to. And so it's going to come out more easily, and there's going to be wiggle room on the inside piece, which was not designed in any way to have wiggle room. So adding wiggle room to a gun part that was not supposed to have wiggle room is just not a recipe for happiness. So let me just get this one last tap through and check the other side, make sure they're in deep enough. Yeah. Okay, so they're not going to interfere with my slide. In theory, I should be able to prove that by making sure that they actually slide. What am I bumping into? Make sure I didn't leave it in the locked position. This gun does have a gun lock. I have the key lying around here somewhere. So when you turn this key, that little ridge comes up and prevents the gun from functioning. And then turning it the other way unlocks it. And to be completely honest, I am not seeing what this thing is getting stuck on. Nothing. Okay. Of course, now I'm stuck on the sear, and I may have left myself no intelligent way to get around that. That's never true. You can always trip the sear. Okay, so yes, we're not going to interfere too much with anything. It's still going to go back and forth. It's still going to run. So the lesson is, in disassembling this, stop here. Don't go any deeper. When you get to this point and the safety The outer part of the safety is still here, and you can get that in and out if you don't mind dealing with the ball bearing. It's going to go in and come out without too much craziness. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I'll show you. It's kind of the next piece that goes in at this point. And what's in here, and they've done this twice in the gun, is a tiny ball bearing at the end of a spring. So this is an old school mechanism, and it's been replaced in almost everything modern by the ball on a stick style detent, which is going to be far more stable and less likely to launch across the room and cause all kinds of problems. Once it's in place, it stays in just fine in the safe position. In the fire position, though, it's going to want to wander out the side of the gun, so leave it in safe while assembling. The next important bit is the trigger bar itself. Now, the pins that actually held it in the gun go through these sleeves, so make sure you don't lose your sleeves. I know we're doing all this in backwards order, but... And then there's... So these are the two pins that held the whole thing in. And then this piece, which is wider on one end than the others, is your trigger pin. And the trigger mechanism, I didn't get the rest of this because it has a little more plastic than I would like in places that I think are going to be hard. So this pin to me looked like the small end had been flattened out a little so that it wasn't going to punch out without destroying the pin itself. It's hard to tell if that's just an optical illusion, but since it's easy to get there and kind of clean off any schmutz that is acquired, and since you can see exactly how the spring works in there, I didn't feel the need to disassemble that. So in terms of where it goes in the gun, that's pretty straightforward. You want to make sure you get the firing pin safety activator here and the actual sear action part all in at the same time. So you kind of come in from the side and have to flex the trigger just a little bit, and then it'll get in there where it needs to be to do its stuff. And it actually goes in front of the safety, so the trigger bar should bump into the safety when the safety's up, so it needs to be in front of it the way we're assembling it. And then we'll take this pin and start it through and just make sure that we actually successfully line up with the rest of it. So now I'm going to hold the safety in place but in the off position, and we can see that the trigger comes back and that it brings the sear down with it. So all of that is happening just the way it's supposed to. Pop the safety back up, and I'm going to talk about how the next piece works, which is that arm, that little, it's not a pin, it's just a permanent protrusion in the body here, is for our slide lock lever, and this pin is the one that does the work, and it has a long end with a little hook and then a short end. The short end is the one that actually operates this. The long end is actually part of the takedown mechanism, and let's see, the way it's built, I think you actually have to do this first because oh, I'm sorry, no, this I was letting the head stick out more than it was supposed to. This head actually goes down flush, so I take it back. We can do this at the right time. So we put that in place, and we just gonna squish it down while it's putting pressure on that arm so that it sits there in its little groove. And with that, we can pop it back in the frame, and it tucks under the frame in the back. Make sure the safety is being pushed in. We'll probably have to press the trigger just a little bit, which means you have to take the safety off, but once it's held in by the side, you're fine. And then make sure that that pin stays down. So this arm of it floats way up here where it holds in, where it's held in by the takedown mechanism, and everything else is just here. So you've got, you pull the trigger, this brings up the firing pin safety. If you push the disconnect, it's going to drop and let the sear reset. And that's the whole mechanism. So, as I said, these two pins, they are not tapered and they are the same length, so it doesn't really matter which one is the front or the back. They just kind of go in. Let's see. Yeah, I drove them out from the other side, so they'll probably go in from this side a little more easily. So that's the lower reassembled. And so since you'll be able to see this a little easier from the back, the takedown pin basically is just set up so you can use it to kind of twist. If you put it in with this part up top, it's gonna, I mean, you can't just put it in, it'll run into the springs, but you can get it under the rail. So once this is under the rail and you twist it, that's going to push down the rest of it. And that's the way it's designed for disassembly, is to pop in like that. So when you're disassembling it, you bring it down so that it most easily can then pop over that spring. And once you get it started, then it's kind of all bets off. Whoops, I dropped a piece. Hell's donkeys. Extra spring from a different gun. Somewhere I have one other long, thin pin, and I didn't do the math on this one yet to figure out what's going on here. This piece slips in from the inside, and at first I thought maybe it had interchangeable back straps or something, but now I have no idea. So somebody leave a comment on what this thing is actually supposed to be doing in my life, because right now it's just a odd curiosity with its own little pin. Pin that apparently doesn't want to drive in without more pressure than I feel like giving it. There it goes. So anyway, that holds that in. Yay. Like I said, I'm glad it's held in, but I'm not sure why. Okay. So, again, taking the parts you can take apart really easy. You're going to take those two pins out, lift it up and forward, hang on to the safety. And at that point, the safety can be removed carefully. Actually, I would take the trigger pin out at that point, take the trigger arm off, then carefully on the safety so you don't launch that spring in detent. And that's it. Don't mess with the rest of the sear system. There's no benefit to you to doing it, and it's already, recalled gun with recalled bits. So just play with it one last time, and then tell Taurus, send me a nice brand new G2. Okay, so now the upper has plenty of stuff that we can do, but is a mishmash of designs I've never quite seen all cobbled together in one firearm before. And for all that complexity, it lacks the two things that it needed most: a beefy firing pin safety and some kind of drop safety. The other thing I would say is about the lock. The lock is extremely extremely difficult to get back together because, again, it has a tiny ball. It's smaller than the last ball and spring mechanism. And unlike the other one where you just set it up and push something straight down on it, this one is actually under this hole, and you have to push an oddly shaped piece in from the side, and there's room for that ball to go backwards. So if you put something in to hold the ball down and then try and smoosh it in with the other piece, it's just going to knock the ball back inside, and you never get out of that battle. It took me about 30 minutes once I got the ball out to get it back in. So again, unless you for some reason just want to take the lock out, that which is easy, you drive this pin out, drive it out from the top to the bottom, and at that point they can just push the whole mechanism right out and throw it away. It leaves a pretty nasty hole, and I'd say it's easier to just leave it in the unlocked position and throw away the key. Okay, so stripping it down, a little tricky. Wow, if I say again, somebody just smack me. This piece over the end is not actually functional, it's decorative. And the way you get it off is it actually lifts off this other little plastic piece. And then once it's lifted off, you can just kind of push it the rest of the way off, and it'll wiggle its way out the back for you. And it's just an end cap. Now you can see the actual retaining plate, and the back of the firing pin spring is this green plastic bit, and then this metal piece is the actual retainer. And you got a couple things that look strange here. So the firing pin itself, this is the striker. This is the striker's surface that it holds with the sear here. So when you cock it, that's what you're pulling back. That pushes this red spring underneath. That's the firing pin spring, kind of behind the whole thing. There's this other little spring here, and it is little. If I move the striker forward, you might be able to see that spring is actually just that long and no longer. So it's just a rebound spring. If the striker goes all the way forward, I'm pushing the firing pin safety in. That's what makes sure that it comes back. Now, here's another part of your malfunctioning issues. In a setup that uses a return spring, the return spring should always be strong enough to pull it to the point where the safety re-engages. This one is not. That's yet another issue with this thing. All right, so let's get into the meat of it. We want to remove this mechanism, and the way to do that is to take a punch that's pretty close to the same size as the green bit there, so a nice fat punch, and you're going to push that green bit in to the point where you can get the back plate started to lift up. And notice I'm putting my thumb to catch the bits that are going to come shooting out. And here you have that back plate, and it's really easy to figure out which way it goes because it matches the contours of the gun. There's a high side and a low side, and they match up, a high side and a low side here. And so that part's pretty straightforward. And then the only thing that's a little bit tricky here is that this piece, this green piece, is actually a hexagon or an octagon, and it has to move through a round chamber here to get it out. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's an octagon. Sorry. And that's it. That's its whole little beefy bit. So in its action, it rides up and down. This little plastic guy is the whole thing. Now, the firing pin itself can come out, and this little spring can come off that pole. This is a permanent thing. This originally looked like maybe that's a pin that you could knock it out. I don't believe it is. I think that's a weld point, maybe. I don't know what it is. But either way, don't try and take this guy out. Everything just rides along it. This striker has a hole so that it can ride along it. And so unlike just about every other striker in the world, it actually has something outside of the actual shaft shape that's going to always hold it in alignment fairly rigidly, fairly high up. So in other guns, you'll see just a cut chamber that rides on both sides of the striker. that the striker moves through. This one left the whole thing open and just added this pin for it to ride on, which gave them somewhere to put their rebound spring. So this striker actually has an area inside where this spring bottoms out, and so that's how you get your compression. And the lock engages in this notch here, so as well as blocking the rails from moving, it actually is locking the firing pin in place so that the firing pin cannot move. You can only lock it when the firing pin's in the right spot. Otherwise, if the firing pin is fired or too far back, it won't lock. And the noticeable thing that's missing is there's no specific engagement in the firing pin or striker for the firing pin safety, for the striker safety. So it literally just has to get somewhere in the way of the whole tip of it. So that has to pop something into the way to keep this whole tip from going forward. That's a little bit odd design, not completely unheard of, just a little bit odd. So now, what did I just launch it myself? Crap, hang on. I launched the safety cap. So it has a loaded chamber indicator built in on top of the extractor, so that if there's a round in there, there's a little lever that pokes out. So it's got its own different spring that it operates on, and they come out and in as a unit though. And again, you're going to see one of those serrated head pins. And that means don't knock it from the top to the bottom, or you'll be knocking those serrations through the whole slide through there and all that. That means it comes out from the bottom to the top. And let's find the right size punch. I keep saying to myself I've only got the 3 punches I'm supposed to be using. How do I keep managing to lose the one I really want? And the answer is because I keep putting it in the wrong spot. Alright, so we're just going to knock that guy out, and then we're going to be careful to hold on to the remaining parts. So again, taking a good look at it. Hopefully this will focus, and you can see those gear-like serrations at the head of the pin. Do not ever drive that into something. Always let it be the last thing that encounters the rest of the metal. I'm going to put my thumb on this pretty stiffly because this does tend to launch if you're not careful. And when I'm removing it, well, there you go. The firing pin safety is also going to launch out the bottom. But what I was more paying attention to was this tiny spring here that operates the loaded chamber indicator. You really want to grab that as a unit. And because the extractor has an overhang, you have to work with the gun. It can't come straight out the side. It has to come in and then out, because otherwise the lip gets caught up on the gun. So there is still a... Hi, I'm doing a video. So anyway, let me just, so I don't want to hold this all night. That little spring, there is a little hole in it, but basically it's just holding that in. So once we relieve the pressure there, you can see that itty bitty spring does have a accompanying appropriately sized hole for it to sit in, which is, all well and good, but it's still a darn tiny spring, which means when it comes time to put it back into place, you kind of have to hold a finger over it and then hold the whole thing so it doesn't go launching. So I'm going to separate them just a little bit temporarily while we work on it, so that I don't have to worry about that spring. And now there's 2 other springs. There's the extractor spring itself, which is the larger of the 2, and then there's the spring for this guy, the actual safety, and he's going to be tucked way down in the hole. And this is a much lighter spring, so you can compare the 2, and they're pretty hard to they might be similar in height, but one is obviously a much thinner metal, and that the thinner one is the firing pin safety. Now here's where I had my complaint. This is not a lot of spring tension, and it does go under the firing pin safety. But basically, I think that the big design flaw, as I understand how this whole thing functions, is that when this firing pin safety is down, then this curve here matches the barrel of the firing pin. But this surface here that's just cut and flat, that's not a great surface for blocking this, especially if it doesn't block completely. This, because it's you can even see the marks on mine if the lighting's good enough, or something sharp to point with. This wear mark here is half the story for these failures. In other words, this safety doesn't move far enough. I mean, it only gets brought from here down to level with this plane. So it only moves up and down that distance, which means that that's the whole engagement difference between on and off. Now, if it popped all the way up and the exact side of the firing pin barrel hit this, then it would be fine. It wouldn't be going anywhere, and you'd see a whole semicircle wailed out in there. But in fact, it's just this little tiny corner of the firing pin that can actually engage with it. And that's not much, and that means that as you get a little bit of wear, it's going to be more easy for the firing pin to actually push through that and draw this down. And I think that's where their whole safety mechanism fell apart. So, like I said, I'm not going to deal with a lock unless somebody really asks me to, because it's takes as much time as everything else involved in the process just to get that thing lined up again. Now, gazing down into this, there is several levels of holes the way they cut that out. I don't know if you can tell. The key is the firing pin spring drops into the deepest one, and so when you're putting this back in, you want to make sure that it finds its way all the way down and into that deepest part. And then again, keeping in mind the outside bit kind of holds in the extractor a little bit, not a lot. But I'm going to hold that in with my thumb while I come over here and do my assembly trick here of using my finger to hold that spring bit. I don't know how long I can leave it unattended like that without it deciding to do something fairly nasty to me. And now, I didn't find a good way to do this yet, because this spring sits there, and so I can't drop it into the slide first, because it's going to want to roll to the back or fall over. So in a perfect world, I'm going to switch thumbs here, reorient this so I can hold in the firing pin safety. I'm going to try and get this all lined up so I can hold the whole thing and hold not only this floppy spring, but the one that's holding those pieces together all in my hand at the same time. I'm going to come down from the inside so that it's levered over what it needs to lever over, and then I'm going to set it in. And if I've done it right, firing pin safety will operate, which it does. And all I have to do now is drive this pin through. Now, always eyeball the path that pin is going to go through to make sure that your extractor is as well lined up as you can get it. And when you start to tap it in, you kind of go gentle till you find when it's actually made a bite, and then you can swap to a good old punch and pound it down. Now remember, since this is serrated, if you manage to line up the original serrations with the current ones, that's great, but the better lesson is to just don't wail on it when you put it in. It doesn't need to be beat down deeper than flush. It doesn't need to be protruding out the bottom or anything crazy like that. That's really all it needs. So reassembling the rest of it. First is the little rebound spring. So that goes onto onto that permanent pin. Then the striker itself goes in, and make sure that you guide it and get it started so it goes onto the little pin as well. And then the next piece, this one, if you look carefully at this in profile, you'll see that it is cut at an angle, and so you want to match the angle of the slide. You don't want it, logically that's how it's going to be, because that's how the piece it fits into is made, and so all that kind of comes down at that same angle. I said that, and now I wonder if it's completely true. Yeah, because if it's at the wrong angle, then this won't stick out the right amount. So that should be the right angle to match the back. So anyway, essentially the longer side is the bottom, and it's not going to line up perfectly no matter what you do, is what it kind of comes down to, because then you've still got to get it square peg in a round hole style to get started there. So that's as close an orientation as I think I'm going to get it, and remembering to orient this correctly so the large side from this perspective is on the left. And what you really got to make sure is that the green piece is not in the ridges where this wants to live when you get it going. So you want to get it started a little bit before you put any real pressure in there. Get that guy ready to drop down in place, and then spring tension and push it down, and it should pop out. And in this case, it popped out. It just didn't pop all the way out, which is mildly annoying. Not sure if it's actually hung up on anything or if it's just being annoying because I'm trying to demonstrate. Yeah, as the gun fires, that'll work itself out further. It's not going anywhere. And then you can pop this little cap back over, just slide it in, and where it meets up with the metal piece, it will just pop over it and snap. And that's just now that's retained, covering all your bits. And so basic check is that firing pin, there's no protrusion. Oh geez, maybe that's part of the problem too, is I can actually get a little protrusion no matter what. Anyway, once you actually activate the firing pin safety though, then you get true protrusion, and in a perfect world that would snap back on its own. So a lot of little flaws in this guy, but since you can swap him out for a free G2, at least I hope to. We'll make another video when I get that back from Taurus. That's my plan. I'm going to go shoot this a few times just for fun, but since we know what the problem is with it, unless it has sentimental value, get a free new gun. So if you lock that back to put the actual locking piece in, you want to pay attention with the barrel. You want to be able to look through and see where the lug in the barrel is and make sure that you line that up. Otherwise the barrel will be too far back or too far forward. So take care when you do that. It's basically going to be right around even with the back or with the front of the chamber. And then, like I said, we can start this in a little bit, get it under the rail, and twist it till it lines up, and then pop it in, hopefully, and that's it. So, that's fully assembled. That's another issue. This one does not always, the trigger return does not always return all the way for that double action. Well, now it is. So I'm not a big fan of these double single striker fired guns. Alright, now it's behaving. I think it might just be illusionary in my head that if I haven't let it come all the way out, yeah, I was grabbing it before it was hitting the end. If I let it come all the way out, yeah, it's just that final reset for double action is way out there. So since I traditionally fire striker fired pistols as singles anyway, not a big deal. So and the safety is trigger blocking. However, if you pull the trigger, you can put the safety on after that. It prevents the trigger from actually resetting all the way until you do that. So that's the PT145 Pro. Hopefully that'll let you get it all back together if you started getting it apart. And if you're having problems getting it apart, just run the video backwards. No, I'm just kidding. Like I said, stay out of that sear system. That's the whole meat of the recall. So there's no reason to tempt fate. Hope you had fun. Stay safe.